The moment that changes everything. What would you do if you watched a 70-year-old black woman, gentle, dignified, carrying nothing but her husband's prescription, get shoved, handcuffed, and humiliated right in front of you for no reason at all? What would you do if you saw fear in her eyes? Fear she tried to hide behind decades of strength, while a police officer treated her like a threat instead of a human being. And what if I told you that this woman wasn't just someone's grandmother, but a retired federal judge with the power to expose an entire system that had been hurting vulnerable people for years? This story isn't just shocking, it's heartbreaking, it's infuriating. It is a mirror held up to America, and what it reflects will shake you. Because what happened to Ruth Thompson? It was not an accident, not a misunderstanding, not a moment of confusion. It was racial profiling. It was an abuse of power. And it was the spark that exposed a deep-rooted pattern of injustice that had been hiding behind badges, procedures, and silence. In the next few minutes, you're going to learn how one woman's humiliation turned into a firestorm of truth that shook a police department to its core, challenged an entire community, and demanded that America choose between silence or justice. And trust me, once you step into this story, your heart won't let you turn away. Before we begin, if you believe in truth, in justice, in human dignity, in building a better America together, subscribe to the Racial Truth Channel right now. Hit that button, join this movement, and continue watching stories that open eyes, heal hearts, and inspire courage. Because this story will change the way you see the world. Now, let's step into the moment that changed everything, the shatter point. The first shove wasn't the kind that knocks a person down. It was the kind that tells them exactly where they fall in another man's world. Get your black hands away from that counter. The words hit before the impact did, before the gasp from the woman in line, before the bottle flew from her grasp. The heel of Officer Mark Reynolds' hand struck Ruth Thompson square between the shoulder blades, jolting her forward into the edge of the pharmacy counter. The air fled her lungs in a sharp, stunned breath as her palms scraped against the laminate surface. The orange medication bottle slipped from her hand and clattered to the floor. Pills scattered across the tile, tiny white circles rolling into the cracks, skittering under the shelves, disappearing into shadows where dust lived. Her reading glasses slid from her nose and dropped after them, hitting the ground with a crack that sounded too much like breaking bone. One lens fractured into a spiderweb of glittering lines. For a heartbeat, silence swallowed everything. The fluorescent lights hummed above her like angry insects. Her ribs throbbed from the blow. Her 70-year-old bones protested the sudden violence. But the pain inside, somewhere deeper, older, hurt more. She had lived through decades of indignities, but not like this. Not here. Not in a place that was supposed to be safe. "I'm just picking up my husband's medication," Ruth managed, turning her head slightly toward him, her breath trembling. "Shut your mouth." Reynolds' voice was low and sharp, meant for her alone. His fingers clamped around her arm, twisting it behind her back. "You people always think you're above the rules." Those two words carried a century of weight. You people. The kind of phrase that could slice through a lifetime of resilience. Someone gasped behind her. Someone else whispered, "Oh my God, is he serious?" A phone rose in trembling hands. Another followed, then another. Screens blinked awake like a constellation forming around her humiliation. But nobody stepped closer. Ruth steadied herself against the counter. Her heart hammered, but her voice, when she finally found it, carried the dignity she had cultivated through 7 decades of grit, grace, and unrelenting perseverance. "Officer, please," she said softly. "You're hurting me." "Good. Maybe you'll learn." He yanked harder. The pain shot up her shoulder like fire. She swallowed a cry. This was Hillside, Connecticut, one of the state's wealthiest suburbs, a place where residents boasted tree-lined streets, good schools, and the kind of coffee shops that sold peace of mind by the cup. A place she and her husband Daniel had chosen for its quiet, its safety, its promise. A place where she had believed, naively, foolishly, that dignity was non-negotiable. Reynolds jerked her arm again, and something deep in her back spasmed. She clenched her jaw, refusing to collapse under the weight of his grip. The pharmacist, a tall young man with an earnest face, stepped forward. "Officer, Miss Thompson is a regular customer," he said, voice tight with fear and outrage. "She comes in every month. I filled this prescription myself." Reynolds raised one finger, not even turning to look at him. "Step back, now!" The pharmacist froze, uncertainty twisting his expression. His hands, which had been hovering above the counter, retreated slowly. The moral courage in his eyes dimmed beneath the cold authority of the badge. Ruth lowered her gaze to the scattered pills on the floor. Each tiny tablet represented one day of life for Daniel. One day of hope, one day with her, one day with the man whose heart had grown too fragile to trust without medicine. She had kissed his cheek before leaving the house that morning, promising she'd return quickly. He'd smiled at her with that gentle, uneven smile. The one stroke had altered, but not erased. She had never imagined returning home like this. "Ma'am," the voice came from the pharmacy technician, a young woman barely in her 20s. "Please, just let him." The girl's voice faded, smothered by fear. Reynolds stepped behind Ruth, his shadow falling across her like a storm cloud. "What are you doing with that medication?" he demanded loudly now, performing for the phones pointed at him. "Looks to me like you're planning to resell. This pharmacy is a known target for drug diversion." Ruth blinked, stunned. "Sir, it's blood pressure medication. It's for my husband. I have his card." "Don't play dumb," he snapped. "Turn around, hands on your head." She did not move. Her years on the bench had taught her one thing clearly. Bullies grew stronger in silence, in the quiet corners where no one pushed back. But her voice was her lifelong instrument of justice. And even now, even trembling, even humiliated, it rose on instinct. "Officer Reynolds," she said, steady and sure, "I need you to reconsider what you're doing." He scoffed. "You threatening me?" "I am stating that you're making a mistake. Hands behind your back." She didn't obey. She stood tall, though her knees quivered, though her heart raced, though humiliation pressed on her like a physical weight. The phones recorded everything. The young mother near the greeting cards pulled her child behind her, whispering urgently. The teenager in the varsity jacket continued filming, eyes wide. The older white man in the business suit stepped back, unwilling to intervene but unwilling to leave. Ruth's ears filled with the low hum of fluorescent lights, the soft thump of background music, the sound of her own pulse. The world felt distant and too close all at once. "That's enough," Reynolds growled. And then he grabbed her. Her body turned sharply. Her foot caught on the edge of a floor mat. Her prescription bottle was crushed under Reynolds' boot with a soft crunch. She felt the cuff clamp around her wrist, metal biting into her thin, aging skin. Click. A wordless sound escaped her throat. Not pain, not fear, but disbelief. Click. The second cuff snapped shut. The finality of it struck her harder than the shove. A 70-year-old black woman, handcuffed in a pharmacy for picking up heart medication. A lifetime spent serving justice, now reduced to this moment of power abused and dignity stripped bare. Reynolds pushed her forward. Her glasses dangled broken from the chain around her neck. The aisle seemed impossibly long. Every step jarred her knees. She willed her spine to stay straight, her chin lifted. A small group parted as she passed. Their faces carried shame, anger, and helplessness. Some held phones out of a sense of duty, some out of morbid fascination, some simply froze, trapped between complicity and fear. "Keep moving," Reynolds barked, tightening his grip. Her breath hitched, her pride trembled, but she kept walking. Once outside, a blast of March air slapped her cheeks. Cars slowed. A jogger stopped mid-stride, frowning at the sight of an elderly woman in cuffs. A man with a dog muttered, "What the hell?" A delivery driver paused, pulling out his phone. The humiliation spread like wildfire. Reynolds steered her toward his squad car, parked crookedly in a handicapped space, a bitter detail that stung more deeply than she expected. "You cannot arrest her for picking up a prescription," the pharmacy technician cried from the doorway. "Watch me," he shot back. He opened the rear door. The cracked plastic seat inside looked like a cage. Ruth hesitated, not out of fear, but out of something heavier. The sense that crossing this threshold meant crossing into a world she had spent her entire life fighting to reform. Reynolds placed a hand on her head and shoved. Her body folded into the car. Pain radiated down her shoulders. She closed her eyes as the door slammed shut. Through the glass, she saw faces watching, recording, judging. She wondered how many would remember this moment tonight. She wondered how many would forget. Inside the car, the air smelled of disinfectant and despair. Reynolds walked around toward the driver's seat, adjusting his body camera to capture her face clearly. He sat down, started typing into his dashboard computer, and spoke into the radio. Dispatch Unit 3, one detained for suspected drug diversion. Elderly, black female. Non-compliant. The lie, clean, effortless, hung in the air like smoke. Ruth lifted her head slowly. Her wrist burned. Her dignity was battered. Her heart ached with a sorrow no cuffs could contain. And yet, beneath all that pain, something stirred. Something sharp. Something unyielding. "Officer Reynolds," she said softly. He didn't look at her. "You are making a mistake you cannot undo." He exhaled impatiently. "Save it." Her gaze hardened. Her voice lowered. Her next words would shatter his certainty and begin unraveling the system that had protected him for years. "Officer," she said again, "you have no idea who you just put in handcuffs." Before the storm, Ruth Thompson began her Tuesday the way she had begun every Tuesday for the past 8 months, since the night her husband's heart nearly stopped while she was standing at the kitchen sink, humming an old Sam Cooke song. Back then, the world had tilted, and ever since, her mornings had been arranged around keeping him alive. They woke before dawn, when the Connecticut sky was still a cool shade of blue that felt like quiet hope. Ruth shuffled into the kitchen of their small colonial-style home in Hillside, her slippers whispering against the hardwood floors Daniel had refinished by hand 20 years ago. She brewed his coffee first, half-calf now, doctor's orders, and then hers. She prepared toast cut into careful triangles the way he liked since the stroke, the way that made chewing easier. The routine wasn't just for him, it steadied her too. At 6:10 a.m., she set the tray on the breakfast table. At 6:12 a.m., he joined her, one slow step after another, his gait uneven but improving weekly. At 6:15 a.m., she placed the small orange pill bottle beside his plate. Except today, when she reached for it, it felt lighter. She shook it gently. Only one lonely tablet rattled inside. Her stomach dipped. Daniel looked at her across the table, his eyes warm and familiar. The left side of his mouth drooped slightly, residual from the stroke, but the smile still had its old gentleness. "Ruth?" he asked softly, noticing her hesitation. She forced a smile. "We're just about out. I'll pick up your refill after lunch. You won't miss a dose." He nodded, trusting her completely. That trust, quiet, unspoken, enduring, had been the cornerstone of their 50-year marriage. Through every trial, every loss, every hard winter, and every joyful spring, he had trusted her to hold their world steady. And she had trusted herself not to fail him. But a single missed dose of his medication could strain his heart. The cardiologist had warned her in a firm tone that left no room for negotiation. Even one lapse can increase risk. So she made a promise that morning as she cleared the breakfast plates. "I will come back home on time, with the medicine. I will keep him safe." She kissed Daniel's forehead. His skin felt warm beneath her lips. He returned the gesture with a light squeeze of her hand, a rhythm they had invented in their 30s, when life felt endless. 2 squeezes meant, "I love you." 3 meant, "Don't worry." He squeezed twice that morning. Ruth held the back of his hand before letting go. She lingered just a few seconds longer, something inside her urging her to memorize the feel of his skin under her palms. She brushed the thought away. It was just sentimentality, she told herself, just the fatigue of caregiving. She didn't know then that the hours ahead would stretch that promise between life and loss. The pharmacy on Brookline Road. Hillcrest Pharmacy sat on the corner of Brookline and Hawthorne, tucked between an upscale bakery and a boutique candle shop. It was the kind of neighborhood where people waved without knowing each other's names, where lawn signs announced charity drives, where neighbors borrowed sugar and returned the container full. A place that believed, foolishly, that racism lived somewhere else. Ruth had been coming here since the stroke. The staff all knew her. They asked about Daniel. They remembered which labels needed to be printed in large font. They greeted her with real warmth, the kind that felt earned, not performed. The manager, a soft-spoken man named Michael Nguyen, often chatted with her about the weather, books, or the changing seasons. The technician, Ellie, always offered to carry heavy bags to the car. It was one of the few places where her age, her blackness, her professional past, all existed without tension. People smiled at her here. She smiled back. So when she arrived at 2:20 p.m., and wearing her good navy coat, her reading glasses hanging from the thin silver chain around her neck, she walked in with steady steps. The bell above the door chimed its usual pleasant ding. The line was short. A businessman is checking his watch. A teenager tapping at a phone. A mother balancing a toddler on her hip. Life felt ordinary. Ruth held Daniel's insurance card and ID tightly in her hand, repeating the prescription number in her mind out of habit. RX 291407 Lisinopril 20 mg. Once daily, his lifeline in a bottle. Michael looked up from behind the counter, his face brightening when he saw her. "Ms. Thompson, how's Mr. Thompson today?" "Better," she said. He walked to the mailbox without needing to rest. "That's wonderful," Michael said, genuinely happy. "I'll get your order." Normal, routine, reassuring, everything in the next 20 minutes would be destroyed. The unseen convergence. 2 blocks away, Officer Mark Reynolds sat idling in his patrol SUV, his fingers drumming impatiently on the steering wheel. Dispatch chatter crackled through his radio. A performance review loomed over him, one that required higher arrest productivity. His supervisor had mentioned pharmacies. "Hotspots," they said. "Watch for suspicious behavior." Reynolds had already made 2 arrests that week, but he needed 3 before the end of his shift to impress the captain. He felt the familiar itch of urgency, the pressure to produce numbers. And he felt something else too, an unspoken entitlement that had been fed, nurtured, and rewarded over the years. His gaze flicked to the pharmacy entrance. An elderly black woman walked inside. She moved slowly, carefully. Her clothes are neat. Her expression was focused. He watched her through the windshield, a silhouette framed by bright windows. She approached the counter, leaned in slightly, read something in her hand, paused longer than he thought she should. Suspicious, he decided, not because of what she did, but because of what she looked like. A lifetime of bias disguised as instinct guided him. He turned off the engine, stepped out of the SUV, and walked toward the pharmacy with a purpose sharpened by certainty. There's my easy arrest. The bell that should have warned her inside. Ruth waited as Michael retrieved the medication. Ellie smiled at her from the side counter. The toddler had stopped fussing and now clung to her mother's coat. It felt like any other day, the kind she took comfort in. Until the bell chimed again. This time the sound landed differently. Too crisp, too sharp, too much like a warning. She couldn't interpret it soon enough. Reynolds walked in with the kind of stride that announced itself before the man did. His boots hit the floor with the rhythm of possession. His eyes swept the pharmacy, already judging, already choosing. Ruth felt the shift in the atmosphere before she saw him. The temperature seemed to drop. The air thinned. People straightened instinctively. She turned slightly, just enough to catch the glare in his eyes. He was angry at something, or someone. Maybe her, maybe the world. She couldn't yet tell, but she felt a tired, cold ache inside her ribs, a place that remembered too many moments when her blackness drew suspicion before her humanity drew compassion. He approached her with authority sharpened into accusation, and everything, the warmth of the pharmacy, the safety of routine, the promise she made Daniel, cracked down the middle. The interrogation begins. "What exactly are you doing with that medication?" Reynolds demanded, loud enough for the whole line to hear. Ruth blinked, startled. "I'm picking up my husband's prescription." "Your husband's, huh?" He stepped closer. "Or are you reselling it?" Her heart stumbled in her chest. "Reselling? Sir, this is blood pressure medication. Why would anyone—" "Don't play games with me." His hand hovered near his holster. People shifted uncomfortably. She reached for her bag. I have his insurance card and his ID and the refill. He cut her off with a harsh, slicing tone. Turn around, hands on the counter. Something inside her trembled, not fear, recognition. She had sentenced officers like him before, men who weaponized authority, who bent truth into submission, who believed their badge made them untouchable. But she had never been on this side of their cruelty. Lessons in pain. As the confrontation escalated, the world around Ruth shrank to a few painful truths. Racism does not need a reason. Dignity can be undone in seconds. Silence from bystanders can hurt more than violence. And that even a 70-year-old woman can become a target simply for existing. Yet she also felt a deeper truth stirring beneath her ribs. When injustice strikes the innocent, truth becomes a duty, not a luxury. She inhaled slowly, tasting antiseptic air, the bitterness of fear, and the acidic burn of humiliation rising from her stomach. Her voice, when she found it, trembled, but did not break. Officer Reynolds, she said, please listen. He didn't. Not yet. Not until after he shoved her. Not until after he crushed the pills meant to keep Daniel alive. Not until after he pushed a 70-year-old woman into a patrol car like she was a criminal. Not until she told him the words that would mark the beginning of the end of his career. But that moment was still minutes away. For now Ruth stood, dignity trembling, heart pounding, completely unaware that her quiet Tuesday afternoon was about to rip open not just a wound, but an entire system. And the world would soon watch. The humiliation. The moment Officer Reynolds reached for his handcuffs, something ancient inside Ruth Thompson stiffened. An instinct sharpened over 7 decades of surviving in a country that believed blackness required proof of innocence. Her wrists trembled, not from age alone, but from the shock of watching her entire identity. Judge, wife, caretaker, grandmother, neighbor, collapsed into one degrading assumption. Suspect. He seized her shoulder, spinning her so abruptly that her glasses swung on their silver chain and smacked her chest. The room tilted. Her right knee buckled. The prescription bottle lay crushed on the tile behind them, its contents scattered like broken promises. Ellie, the technician, gasped. Officer, stop! She didn't do anything. Reynolds shot her a glare sharp enough to freeze her mid-step. Stay out of this. The threat wasn't loud, but it hit with a force that made the younger woman recoil instinctively. Ruth saw Ellie's hands hovering uselessly in the air, fingers trembling with the conflict between morality and fear. Ruth recognized that look. She had seen it in courtrooms for years. People who wanted to intervene, but not enough to risk themselves. Reynolds jerked Ruth's arms behind her, wrenching them higher than her joints allowed. Her breath caught in her throat. She felt the familiar stab of pain radiate through her shoulder, the same shoulder she had injured years ago lifting Daniel into the car after his first surgery. She gritted her teeth. She would not cry out. Officer Reynolds, she said through tight breath, you are acting. You don't tell me how to do my job, he snapped. Turn your head straight. His grip tightened until bright sparks danced behind her eyelids. The sound of a cuff closing click. The first cuff locked around her wrist, too tight for her thin skin. The metal bit instantly, leaving a small crescent of pain. Click. The second cuff slid across bone and tightened with a merciless ratchet. That sound, cold, metallic, final, echoed through the pharmacy in a way gunshots sometimes echo through courtrooms. A grandmother in a navy coat, a 70-year-old woman, a retired federal judge, handcuffed like a threat. The teenager with the varsity jacket, who had been quietly filming, whispered to his friend, "Holy crap, this is so wrong." The mother near the greeting cards pulled her toddler closer, shielding the child's view, but not her own. Her eyes were wide and horrified, yet her feet stayed rooted where fear held them. Reynolds treated Ruth not as a person, but as paperwork waiting to happen. A statistic he needed, a box to check, a quota to satisfy. He didn't see the humanity in her eyes. Or maybe he did, and it simply didn't matter. Walk, he ordered. She did because her arms were twisted behind her, and the alternative was being dragged. Every step sent waves of pain shooting through her wrists. Her joints were old. They resisted the unnatural position, Her pride, however, her pride refused to bend. As she walked past the watching crowd, she forced her chin up, even though humiliation burned her cheeks. She saw judgment. She saw sympathy. She saw apathy. She saw fear. She saw the silent struggle in each person between conscience and comfort. But she also saw phones recording, and she knew somewhere in the distant chambers of her trained legal mind that truth had just gained witnesses. Aisles become gauntlets. Reynolds guided her, no, pushed her, down the main aisle. Her blazer twisted awkwardly against her back. Her glasses dangled crookedly from their chain. The floor seemed to tilt beneath her shoes as customers parted, as water around a stone dropped in their midst. People murmured, "This is unbelievable. She's someone's grandmother. What did she do?" "Nothing. That's the point." Some followed the spectacle quietly, holding phones like shields, like proof they might need later. Ruth felt their eyes on her like hands. Some cold, some comforting, all impossible to ignore. One step, another, another. Each one carved itself into her memory. The pills meant to keep Daniel's heart beating were still crushed on the pharmacy floor. The thought made bile rise in her throat. "Officer," she managed, "my husband is expecting me. He needs those pills." Reynolds scoffed loudly. "Should have thought of that before you started dealing." The cruelty of the words struck her with more force than the shove, not because she believed them, but because he did, or because he wanted to, because it made his job easier if she wasn't a person. Through the automatic doors, the sliding doors parted with a sound too gentle for the violence unfolding. Cold spring air rushed in, chapping her face. Her eyes watered, not from emotion, but from the sting of the wind. Out on the sidewalk, more strangers stopped to stare. A woman walking her dog froze mid-step. A delivery driver leaned against his truck and began recording. A man in gym clothes muttered, "What kind of nonsense is this?" Reynolds paid none of them any mind. He was too busy performing authority. He marched her to the patrol car, parked illegally in a handicapped space. The irony was so sharp it nearly made her laugh. Almost. "Officer Reynolds," called a voice behind them. Ellie again, breathless. "You're making a mistake." Reynolds waved her off with a dismissive flick of his hand. "Go back inside before you lose your job." His casual cruelty chilled Ruth more than the cold air. Being put inside the car. When he opened the door, the interior smelled of sweat, plastic, and the memory of fear left by people who had sat in this same seat before her. Reynolds placed his hand on her head, not gently, and pushed. She bent awkwardly, her spine protesting, her wrists screaming from the metal digging into them. Her forehead brushed the edge of the doorframe. She sucked in a quick breath. Once seated, the cuffs forced her shoulders back at an unnatural angle. Pain seeped through her joints like slow poison. Her glasses swung forward and tapped her collarbone with a faint thud. She blinked hard, adjusting to the dimness of the car interior. The window beside her was smudged with fingerprints, ghosts of those who had been here before her. Her own reflection stared back at her, a tired, hurt woman fighting not to look broken. Reynolds closed the door with a slam that reverberated through the vehicle. Outside, the phones kept recording. Inside, humiliation pooled in her chest like water rising. But beneath that humiliation, something else stirred. Not rage, not yet. Resolve. A slow, steady ember begins to glow in the darkness of the patrol car. Reynolds writes his story. Reynolds came around to the driver's side and got in. He adjusted his body camera first, tilting it in a practiced motion to capture her fully through the grating. He wanted a clean story, a neat narrative, one that made him the hero. His dashboard computer glowed. His fingers tapped against the keyboard with the familiarity of routine. "Dispatch," he said into the radio. "Unit 3. One detained for suspected drug diversion. Elderly black female, non-compliant." Each word stabbed her pride like tiny knives. Elderly, black, female, non-compliant. Labels used to reduce her. Words were used to strip her identity down to a stereotype. Ruth inhaled deeply and exhaled slowly, steadying her trembling wrists behind her back. Years in a courtroom had taught her how to hear lies and remain outwardly calm. But this was not a courtroom. This was her life. The cuffs pinched tighter as she flexed her hands, trying to relieve the numbness spreading across her fingers. She winced. Reynolds noticed nothing, or didn't care. The pain of being seen wrong. The patrol car window framed the crowd outside. Neighbors, strangers, people who had judged her fairly for years, and now people who judged her unfairly in one moment. A woman mouthed, "I'm sorry." A man shook his head angrily. Teenagers whispered. A passerby kept filming, unsure whether to intervene or observe. And Ruth realized something painful. Being seen wrongly hurt almost as much as being hurt. She had spent decades crafting a life of dignity, of service, of justice, of fairness. But none of that mattered to this officer. None of it mattered to those who only saw the cuffs. The world could reduce a lifetime to a single moment if the wrong person held the power. Her voice returns. "Officer Reynolds," she said quietly. He didn't respond. "Officer Reynolds," she repeated louder this time. He sighed. "What now?" Her eyes, when he finally glanced in the rearview mirror, were steady. Not angry, not afraid, but profoundly resolved. "You're making a mistake," she told him, her words slow and deliberate. "A serious one." He rolled his eyes. "Everyone says that." "No," she said. "Not like I do." There was a change in her tone he couldn't quite place. Her dignity, though bruised, seemed to rise, filling the cramped patrol car with something he didn't understand. He looked away quickly, dismissively, but not comfortably. "Save it for the judge," he muttered. The smallest, faintest smile touched the corner of Ruth's mouth, not out of amusement, but recognition. Because the moment he said those words, he sealed the beginning of his downfall. She leaned forward slightly, letting her voice carry through the metal grating. "I intend to." Reynolds stiffened. Something in her tone, cold, precise, authoritative, did not match the elderly woman he believed he had power over. A whisper of doubt flickered across his face. He brushed it aside and put the car into gear. The lesson in the humiliation. As the engine rumbled awake, Ruth swallowed the rising burn of tears, not of weakness, but of sorrow. Sorrow for herself. Sorrow for Daniel. Sorrow for every black person who had lived this moment before her. But she also understood something essential. Humiliation, when met with courage, becomes testimony. Pain, when named, becomes power. And injustice, when witnessed, becomes unignorable. The patrol car pulled from the curb, carrying her toward a confrontation that would reshape not just her life, but the illusion of safety in her quiet town. And even as her wrists throbbed and her heart ached, the ember inside her glowed hotter. Because Ruth Thompson was no ordinary woman. And Officer Reynolds had just ignited a fire he could not control. The reveal. The squad car vibrated softly beneath Ruth Thompson as Officer Mark Reynolds settled into the driver's seat. The hum of the engine filled the silence between them, an uneasy, waiting silence, the kind she knew well from the earliest years of her career when she had sat across from hostile attorneys who underestimated her. But this silence was different, sharper, more dangerous. Reynolds adjusted the radio volume, leaned back, and cracked his knuckles as though preparing for routine paperwork. To him, this was just another productive stop, another number on a performance review, another fragile person to intimidate. His confidence filled the front seat like stale air. Ruth watched him through the partition, her wrists burning beneath the cuffs. The metal pinched each time she breathed. Her joints ached from being held at angles her body no longer tolerated. But beneath the pain, something in her mind sharpened. Not a weapon, not a threat, but a truth that had weight and history behind it. She had judged men like him before, and every time they had believed they were untouchable. Reynolds finally spoke, typing lazily on the dashboard computer. "Let me guess," he said without looking at her. "You'll say I'm overreacting, right? That you're innocent, that everyone is picking on you." Ruth inhaled slowly, letting her lungs fill with the cold air trapped in the car. She felt her heart beat steady with each breath. Years of mastering fear had taught her the power of pacing her own pulse. Then in a voice neither loud nor soft but perfectly clear, she said, "Officer Reynolds." He grunted. "What?" I need you to listen to me very carefully. He snorted, almost amused. Lady, I'm not in the mood. You should be, she said. Her tone made him turn his head slightly, not enough to face her fully, but enough that she could see the profile of his stubborn jaw, the faint twitch in his temple, the dismissiveness baked into his expression. Ruth leaned forward as much as the cuffs allowed. Her voice did not tremble. It did not rise. It did not plead. It landed. Officer Reynolds, I am a federal judge. The words hung in the air like a dropped gavel. For a moment, he did not move. His fingers froze above the keyboard. His breath hitched. Not much, but enough for Ruth to see the crack form in his wall of arrogance. What did you just say? He asked finally, turning halfway in his seat. You heard me. No, he said, shaking his head, half laughing. No, that's ridiculous. Ruth held his gaze through the narrow gap in the metal grating, her eyes steady with a lifetime of authority. I am Judge Ruth Marianne Thompson, retired from the Federal District Court for the District of Connecticut. 22 years on the bench, 16 in criminal law. I have presided over cases involving police misconduct, civil rights violations, and federal corruption investigations. Reynolds blinked hard, confusion and panic flickering across his features. No, he muttered again, reaching for his computer. You're bluffing. I am not bluffing. He stared at her as though trying to reconcile the grandmotherly woman in his back seat with the title she claimed. He wanted her to be lying, needed her to be lying, because if she wasn't, his career was already collapsing beneath him. Spell your name, he demanded, voice trembling beneath attempted authority. Ruth, she said calmly. Marianne. Thompson. He typed quickly, breath shortening, pupils shrinking as the search results began to populate. Ruth watched his face, watched the denial melt into disbelief, watched disbelief buckle under recognition. The photo on the screen was younger than she was now. Gray hair less pronounced, face a bit more filled out, shoulders squared beneath judicial robes. But it was unmistakably her. Reynolds' eyes widened. He scrolled, and scrolled, and scrolled. Judicial record, Senate confirmation, commendations, published opinions, 22 years of legal legacy, a career built on integrity and principle. His throat bobbed in a dry swallow. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. He kept reading. Specialized in cases involving law enforcement accountability. Oversaw reforms. Handed down rulings in multiple police misconduct cases. Practiced zero tolerance for excessive force. Her professional identity, the one he assumed did not exist, now stared back at him like a mirror reflecting his own misconduct. Oh my God, he whispered. His hand shook slightly. You're actually a federal judge, she finished for him. Yes. The silence in the car turned suffocating. Outside, the world still moved. Cars passing, people filming, leaves fluttering in the cold wind. But inside, Reynolds felt time stop. You didn't tell me, he said weakly. I did not need to, Ruth replied. Every person deserves dignity in a police encounter, not because of their title, but because they are human. His eyes darted to the cameras outside. The phones still raised. The witnesses documenting everything he had done to a woman whose name held legal weight he couldn't begin to measure. What are they recording? He whispered, throat tightening. The unlawful arrest of a retired federal judge, she said evenly, in broad daylight, without cause, while I was picking up my husband's medication. He closed his eyes, shaking his head. No, I didn't know. You didn't identify yourself. I shouldn't have had to, Ruth said. Respect is not a privilege reserved for certain professions. It is a right, one you denied me. He pressed his palms into his eyes, breathing harder now. His confidence, the swagger he walked in with, crumbled. This is bad, he muttered. This is really, really bad. Ruth straightened, despite the cuffs pulling painfully at her wrists. Officer Reynolds, she said, I sentenced 17 police officers in my time on the bench, each for abuses of power, each for misconduct they believed would go unnoticed. He turned to her, stricken. In every case, she continued, I saw the same thing. A man who thought he was invincible because the system had taught him to believe so. He swallowed hard, Adam's apple bobbing rapidly. That confidence, she said, was always misplaced. Outside, people continued recording. Inside, Reynolds trembled beneath the weight of a truth he hadn't anticipated. What? What do you want me to do? He whispered. That, she replied, is the first honest question you've asked today. He fumbled for his door handle. I'll, I'll let you out. I'll undo the cuffs. Wait. Her voice, not raised, not forceful, yet unquestionable, froze him mid-motion. Before you remove these, she said, lifting her cuffed wrists slightly, understand this clearly. He looked at her, pale and sweating. This moment, she said, cannot be undone. Not by taking off the cuffs, not by apologizing, not by calling your supervisor. The humiliation you inflicted, the prejudice you acted upon, that will follow you. Her next words pierced the air with quiet righteousness. And I will make sure accountability follows as well. Reynolds' face fell into his hands. His breathing grew shallow. He mumbled something that sounded like, I'm finished. Ruth tilted her head back against the seat, allowing herself one long, steadying breath. Pain throbbed through her wrists. Her shoulders ached. Her pride was bruised. Her heart pounded with both fear and growing strength. But beneath all of it, beneath the hurt, the humiliation, the disbelief, she felt something unmistakable. Power returning. Not the power of rank, but the power of truth. The power of a woman who has been wronged and refuses to stay silent. Reynolds finally opened his door and stepped out, his face ashen as he walked around the car. Phones were still recording. People were still watching. History was still unfolding. He opened the back door slowly, hands trembling. Judge Thompson, he whispered, I'm so sorry. She met his gaze with eyes sharpened by 70 years of living and seeing exactly what racism looked like. Sorry, she said, that's not accountability. And with those words, the quietest and most devastating she had spoken all day, she stepped out of the patrol car and into the storm that was only beginning, digging up the rot. By the time the first shaky video of Ruth Thompson's arrest hit social media, the sun had barely begun sliding down behind the slate rooftops of Hillside. It started with a teenager who uploaded the clip while still standing in the pharmacy parking lot. Within 10 minutes, it spread across town. Within an hour, it spread across the state. And by nightfall, it crossed state lines entirely. An elderly black woman handcuffed for picking up medication. No context required, no commentary needed. The video alone became an indictment, and 2 towns over, investigative journalist Sabrina Cole received a text from her nephew, a college sophomore who could spot injustice faster than most people twice his age. Aunt Sabrina, you need to see this. A cop arrested some old black lady at a pharmacy. People say she's a judge. The video's insane. Sabrina clicked the link. The video opened, and her breath caught. On the small screen, Ruth appeared. Glasses cracked, blazer rumpled, dignity battered but unbroken. Officer Reynolds marched her across the pavement like she was a hardened criminal. The camera shook with indignation. Gasps could be heard. A woman cried out, "She didn't do anything!" Sabrina muted the video halfway through, not because she needed less information, but because she needed room in her chest to breathe. She had spent 12 years covering police misconduct across New England. She had seen brutality, cover-ups, and cases buried under bureaucracy. But something about this clip, the age of the woman, the casual cruelty of the officer, the arrogance so deeply unexamined it bordered on ritual, hit her differently. This wasn't policing, this was predation. She opened her laptop, fingers already moving with instinctive urgency. Within minutes, she confirmed the impossible. Ruth Thompson wasn't just a retired federal judge. She was one of the most respected legal minds in Connecticut. A woman known for fairness, for humane rulings, for compassion wrapped in steel. Sabrina whispered into the empty room. He picked the wrong one. The first call, the pharmacy manager. She dialed the Hillside Pharmacy. Michael Nguyen answered on the first ring. Michael, this is Sabrina Cole from the Hartford Sentinel. Were you working during the arrest of a customer named Ruth Thompson? On the other end, silence, then a shaking exhale. Yes, Michael said. I I was there. Tell me what you saw. His voice cracked. She didn't do anything. She hands us her husband's documents every month. She's polite, always patient. This officer, he came in looking angry. He didn't ask questions. He didn't listen. He treated her like she was dangerous. Michael paused, swallowing hard. I tried to tell him she was a regular customer, but he threatened to arrest me too. Sabrina took notes quickly, typing with the steadiness of someone who'd rehearsed this heartbreak too many times. Did the officer have any reason to suspect her? None, Michael said. Absolutely none. His voice carried something more than fear. It carried guilt. The guilt of someone who watched injustice unfold and couldn't stop it. Would you be willing to speak on record? Sabrina asked gently. There was a pause, then, yes, I can't stay quiet. A small crack in the wall of silence that usually protected men like Reynolds. The second call. The police department. Sabrina dialed the Hillside Police Department next. Public Information Office. A clipped voice answered. This is reporter Sabrina Cole. I'm calling about the arrest of Judge Ruth Thompson earlier this afternoon. A long pause. Then the voice responded in a tone overly polished, overly controlled. Officer Reynolds followed department protocol while investigating suspicious activity regarding a potential prescription fraud incident. Sabrina recognized the script immediately. The language of evasion. The vocabulary of institutional stonewalling. Suspicious activity, she pressed. Multiple witnesses say she was compliant and calm. We cannot discuss details of an ongoing internal review. No surprise there. Is the officer on duty right now? Officer Reynolds is currently reassigned, pending evaluation. Reassigned, Sabrina echoed. Not suspended? No further comment. The line went dead. Sabrina stared at her computer screen. She'd seen this pattern before. Language designed to shield an officer from consequences before the public could demand them. The script never changed, but she could. Patterns don't lie. She turned next to Officer Mark Reynolds himself. 12 years on the force, 4 commendations, and something else. Complaints. Buried complaints. Sabrina accessed public records and started digging. What she discovered turned her stomach. 7 misconduct complaints in the last decade. 2 elderly residents are alleging excessive force. 3 black residents are alleging verbal harassment and racial bias. 1 from a Latino teenager claiming he'd been slammed against a patrol car for talking back. 1 from a young woman reporting that Reynolds threatened to find a reason to arrest her if she kept asking questions during a traffic stop. Every complaint had been dismissed as insufficient evidence. Every single one. Sabrina leaned back in her chair, exhaling in disbelief. This wasn't random. This wasn't bad luck. This was a pattern protected by silence and paperwork. She crossed her arms and stared at his record as if she could read the spaces between the lines. You've been hurting people for years, she whispered, and nobody stopped you. Her jaw tightened with resolve. Well, until now. The security footage. The next morning, Sabrina drove to Hillside Pharmacy. Michael met her in his office behind the counter, his face tired and his hands trembling as he queued up the security footage. This is all yours to view, he said. I couldn't sleep last night thinking about what she went through. The footage was played on a small monitor. There was Ruth, patient and calm. There was Reynolds entering with purpose. Not caution, not curiosity, but intent. There was a confrontation, the aggressive body language, Ruth's gentle attempts to reason, her insurance card in her hand, her visible confusion, his escalating hostility, and then the shove, the spin, the fall of the bottle, the handcuffs, the humiliation, silent, devastating proof. Sabrina leaned forward, her throat tightening. This is indisputable. Michael nodded. He pointed his body camera away twice during the confrontation, but our cameras caught everything he tried to hide. He knew what he was doing? Sabrina murmured. Yes, Michael replied softly. He always knew. The data doesn't lie either. After leaving the pharmacy, Sabrina drove to the Sentinel office and began compiling arrest statistics from Hillside PD. What she found made her hands shake as she typed. Reynolds had the highest rate of arrests involving elderly individuals in the department. 3 times the department average. Prescription-related arrests, 4 times the average. And most damning, nearly 90% of those arrests involve Black or Latino residents. The numbers told a story more brutal than the video. Reynolds didn't enforce the law. He hunted the vulnerable. Each line of data was a life disrupted, a heart bruised, a dignity stolen. Ruth Thompson's arrest wasn't an anomaly. It was the continuation of a pattern the department had ignored for years. The smoking gun. Late that afternoon, Sabrina received an email from an anonymous account. No subject line, no message in the body, just one attached file. She clicked it. An audio recording began to play. Reynolds' voice, clear as glass, chillingly casual. Target acquired, elderly Black female. Perfect, easy stat. Sabrina froze. Another voice, Officer Torres, Reynolds' patrol partner, responded. Backup's in position. The captain wants clean paperwork. Go heavy if needed. Reynolds laughed. Relax. These old ones always fold. She won't fight. The audio crackled with static as Sabrina pressed a hand to her forehead, her heart pounding so hard it felt like it might bruise her ribs. This was a conspiracy. This was profiling. This was systemic rot. This was intentional harm. Planned, coordinated, executed. She replayed the recording. Then again. Again. On the third loop, she felt tears prick the edges of her eyes, not from sadness, but from rage sharpened into something almost holy. This wasn't just Reynolds. This wasn't just bias. This was a system preying on those least able to fight back. And they had chosen a 70-year-old Black woman whose only purpose that afternoon was to keep her husband alive. The wider truth: by Thursday morning, Sabrina's investigation was no longer just about one officer and one arrest. New emails and tips poured in. A grandmother who claimed Reynolds shoved her during a traffic stop. A disabled Vietnam veteran who said he was handcuffed for asking a question. A teenage girl who described Reynolds as the cop who enjoyed scaring people. A former Hillside officer anonymously said, "We all knew he targeted minorities. The department didn't want to deal with it." Each story cut deeper than the last. Each voice added weight to the truth. Ruth Thompson hadn't been arrested because she looked suspicious. She had been arrested because Officer Reynolds had been taught, by culture, by quotas, by silence, that he could get away with it. A system that protected him. Sabrina presented her findings to her editor. "This is bigger than what we thought," she said. "Reynolds didn't act alone. His captain pushed quotas. His partner coordinated targets. Internal affairs erased complaints. This is a network of abuse." Her editor stared at her, stunned. "Do we have enough to publish?" Sabrina played the audio recording. Her editor's face went pale. "Oh my God," he whispered. "This will explode." Sabrina nodded, not triumphantly but solemnly. "Good," she said, "because it needs to." She paused, hands trembling slightly above her keyboard. Ruth deserves better than silence. The humanistic truth. As Sabrina began writing, one understanding kept surfacing. Soft, painful, unrelenting. Racism is not always a scream. Sometimes it is a routine, a policy, a quota, a shrug, a system of quiet permissions. Reynolds had not acted alone. Reynolds had never been alone. And if Ruth had not been who she was, if she had been just another elderly Black woman in an affluent town, this arrest would have vanished like all the ones before it. But she was who she was, and this time the system had miscalculated. It had chosen a woman whose dignity had been shaped by decades of protecting others. A woman who had spent her life defending justice. A woman not easily silenced. A woman whose name carried weight. The storm had begun, and the truth, painful, powerful, unyielding, was about to break open everything. Retaliation and breaking point. The morning after Sabrina's investigation broke across the Hartford Sentinel's front page, Ruth Thompson awoke to a feeling she had not known in decades. Fear. Not the kind that comes from a single moment of danger. The kind that comes from realizing an entire system has turned its gaze toward you and does not like what it sees. The article, published at dawn, had already spread across the state. Retired federal judge unlawfully arrested. Pattern of racism and abuse exposed in Hillside PD. It was everywhere. Neighbors who once waved at her on morning walks suddenly did not know where to look. Cars slowed in front of her home. Unfamiliar faces appeared on the sidewalk. And in Daniel's quiet morning exhale, she heard a new tension, an undercurrent of worry he was trying, unsuccessfully, to hide. She wished she could pretend none of it mattered, that the truth alone would be enough. But she had worked too long in federal courts to believe that systems surrendered easily, and systems unwilling to surrender often retaliated. The first threat. The phone rang at 8:03 a.m. Ruth was rinsing the coffee pot when she answered. She didn't bother checking the caller ID. Friends and former clerks had been calling all morning. Hello. At first, nothing, just breathing. And then a voice, deep, scratchy, meant to intimidate. Drop it, Judge. Her grip tightened on the receiver. You don't know who you're messing with, the voice growled. The line clicked dead. Ruth stood motionless in the kitchen, the phone still pressed to her ear. The refrigerator hummed. The faucet dripped. Outside, birds chirped in the early light as if the world itself refused to register the danger coiling around her. She slowly hung up the phone. Her hands trembled, just a little. Not from fear, from recognition. She had seen intimidation used as a weapon by those who feared losing power. But this time, the weapon was pointed directly at her. The escalation threats rarely come alone. Over the next 2 days, the harassment escalated with the cruel efficiency of a system trying to protect itself. At 11 p.m., her phone rang again. She answered out of concern. It might have been Daniel's doctor. Instead, snitches end up buried. The line clicked. At 3 a.m., another call. Sleep lightly, Judge. The sound of someone laughing before hanging up. The following morning, Ruth stepped outside to retrieve the newspaper. On her porch rested a small box. No return address. Her breath caught as she opened it. Inside was a dead rat, and a note written in blocky handwriting, "Silence yourself." She closed the box calmly, her hands steady only by force of will. Anger pressed against her ribs, hot and hollow. Daniel came to the doorway at that moment, leaning heavily on the frame. "Ruth?" he asked softly. "What's going on?" She didn't answer immediately. She didn't want him to see the fear. She didn't want him to feel it in his recovering heart. Instead, she stepped in front of the box, blocking it from his view, and said as gently as she could, "Nothing you need to worry about." But Daniel had been married to her for 50 years. He could hear the tightness in her voice as clearly as if it were shouted. The health crisis. Stress has a way of sneaking past even the brightest optimism. By Friday afternoon, Daniel looked pale. He moved more slowly than usual, pausing between steps as he crossed the living room. His breath came shallow, uneven. At 4:17 p.m., he collapsed in the kitchen. "Daniel!" Ruth caught him awkwardly beneath the arms, lowering him to the floor as gently as she could. His right hand twitched. His eyes fluttered. Not another stroke. Please, not another stroke. She dialed 911 with trembling fingers. The paramedics arrived within minutes. They lifted him onto the stretcher with practiced urgency, asking questions Ruth answered through tears she had not realized were falling. History of heart issues? Yes. Past stroke? Yes. Medication? Yes. He missed one dose. Because... Her voice broke. The ambulance door slammed shut. Sirens split the quiet suburban street. Ruth stood on the curb, hands shaking. The taste of fear thick in her throat. The hospital, Emerson Memorial Hospital, smelled of antiseptic and old grief. Ruth sat in a plastic chair outside the cardiac unit for hours, the fluorescent lights above her flickering with an indifference that felt cruel. At 8:52 p.m., Dr. Patel approached her, his face somber. "Judge Thompson," he said softly, "your husband experienced a hypertensive crisis, likely stress-induced." Ruth closed her eyes. "In simple terms," Dr. Patel continued, "his blood pressure spiked so severely that his heart struggled to compensate. He's stable for now, but any additional stress could be dangerous." Dangerous. The word weighed heavily. "He needs rest," the doctor added firmly. "Peace. Calm. Nothing that raises his stress levels." Ruth nodded numbly, but inside her chest, something cracked, because she knew, deeply, painfully, that the stress threatening her husband's life came directly from the fight she had begun. Her truth was costing Daniel his health, maybe more. She sat beside his bed, watching the rise and fall of his chest. The machines beeped softly, each one a reminder of how fragile the human body and human hope could be. Daniel's fingers twitched in her hand. His eyelids fluttered. He whispered, voice slurred from exhaustion, "Don't. Stop. Ruth." Then his hand went limp again as he slipped back into sleep. Her heart broke, because the fight for justice had become a fight for survival. The visit from Captain Harris. On Sunday morning, as Ruth drank terrible hospital coffee and watched Daniel breathe, a man in uniform entered the room. Captain Robert Harris of the Hillside Police Department. Ruth stiffened. He closed the door behind him, smoothing his tie with the confidence of someone used to negotiating behind closed doors. "Judge Thompson," he greeted, voice polished. "First, let me say, I'm sorry about your husband's condition. Truly." His sympathy felt mechanical, practiced. "What do you want, Captain?" Ruth asked, voice low. He didn't waste time. "We need to find a resolution that doesn't escalate things unnecessarily." He set a folder on the bedside table. "Officer Reynolds is willing to resign. Full pension, clean record, no public admission of wrongdoing." Ruth stared at him. "You want me to accept a cover-up?" "We want to avoid damaging the reputation of innocent officers," Harris replied smoothly. "Dragging this out won't help anyone. Not the department, not you, and certainly not your husband." Ruth felt a wave of anger rise beneath her skin. "So I'm to trade justice," she said slowly, "for peace." Harris shrugged. "Sometimes justice is complicated. Sometimes it's better to be practical." He nodded toward Daniel, unconscious in the hospital bed. "You should focus on what matters most." Ruth's chest tightened. She knew what he was implying, what he was threatening without saying outright. Withdraw, be quiet, save yourself, and your husband. "Take 24 hours, Harris said, gathering his coat. "After that, things will get more difficult for everyone." When he left the room, Ruth felt colder than she had in years. The choice. Ruth stayed beside Daniel until the moon rose outside the glass window of his hospital room. He looked so small beneath the white sheets, so fragile, so unlike the man who once danced with her in the kitchen, who once carried her across a rain-flooded street laughing, who once whispered to her during a trial, "Do the right thing, Ruth, even when it's hard." His blood pressure monitor beeped steadily. Every beep felt like a reminder. "Your fight is killing him." She lowered her head into her hands. For the first time since the arrest, the weight of it all crushed her. Not the humiliation, not the cuffs, not the threats, the possibility of losing Daniel. How could she fight a system bent on protecting itself when the cost might be the man she loved? Her heart split between two impossible choices: protect him or pursue justice. She had sentenced people for terrible crimes. She had listened to victims' testimony until tears soaked her robe. She had believed in justice enough to dedicate her life to it, but she had never imagined justice might demand this much of her. She leaned close to Daniel, whispered into the quiet room, "I don't know what to do." His eyes remained closed. Lights flickered softly above. And Ruth Thompson, who had once commanded courtrooms with unshakable authority, felt smaller than she had since childhood. Like the world had reduced her to a single agonizing truth. Sometimes justice asks more of us than we think we can give. Sometimes love does too. She sat there holding Daniel's hand and felt the weight of the entire system pressing down on her chest. The harassment, the threats, the cover-up, the pressure, the fear, the risk. She felt herself breaking under it, but she didn't yet know. By morning, hope would walk through that hospital door in a way she never expected, and the fight she thought she was carrying alone would become something far bigger, something powerful enough to change everything. Collective fight back. The sun had barely risen over Emerson Memorial Hospital when Ruth Thompson heard a knock on the door of Daniel's room. 3 soft taps, measured, respectful. Ruth lifted her head slowly from where it had rested beside Daniel's hand. Her eyes were swollen from a night of silent crying, silent praying. She had not slept. She doubted she could sleep again until she chose a path and accepted the cost. "Come in," she whispered. The door opened, and Judge Patricia Wilson stepped inside. For a moment, Ruth didn't move. The sight of her old colleague, fierce, brilliant, uncompromising Patricia, felt like sunlight breaking into a windowless room. Patricia looked exactly as Ruth remembered. Sharp suit, hair in a tight bun, gaze bright with intelligence and fire. Only this time, beneath the fire, Ruth saw something else. Fury. Controlled, righteous fury. "Oh, Ruth," Patricia breathed, moving quickly to her side. "What they've done to you, what they're trying to do, it's unforgivable." Ruth swallowed hard. "You saw the news." "I saw everything," Patricia said, gripping Ruth's hands. "And I'm not the only one." She reached into her leather briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. Legal documents, letters, affidavits, statements. 11 other federal judges have signed this, Patricia said. "We are filing an amicus brief supporting your civil rights lawsuit." Ruth blinked. "My lawsuit?" "Yes," Patricia said. "It's already in motion. You're not withdrawing. You're not backing down. Not alone." Ruth looked at the folder, the signatures of colleagues she'd spent years working beside, names of people who knew her, respected her, and trusted her judgment. People stood with her publicly despite the risk. Her throat tightened. "I don't know if I can keep fighting," Ruth whispered. She gestured toward Daniel's hospital bed. "He can't take any more stress, and I can't lose him." Patricia placed a gentle hand on Ruth's shoulder. "You won't lose him," she said, voice soft but steady. "And you won't fight this alone. An entire community is rising because of what happened to you." Ruth's eyes burned. "Why?" she managed. "Why now?" "Because injustice is loud," Patricia said. "But truth, Ruth, truth is louder when we speak it together." The civil rights attorney arrives 2 hours after Patricia's visit. Another knock came. This one was brisk, confident. "Judge Thompson?" a deep voice asked from the doorway. Ruth turned to see an older black man in a charcoal suit standing tall with the bearing of a man who knows exactly who he is. "I'm attorney Malcolm Green," he said, stepping into the room. "My firm handles civil rights litigation. I'm here to represent you." Ruth blinked in disbelief. "I didn't request counsel yet." "You didn't have to," Malcolm replied. "Your story shook the entire state. And frankly," he gave a wry, sad smile, "we've been waiting decades for a case exactly like this." He pulled up a chair, his expression shifting from gentleness to steel. "Officer Reynolds didn't just make a mistake," he said. "He carried out a pattern of racially targeted arrests, and the Hillside Police Department enabled him, protected him, rewarded him." He opened a folder and slid several pages toward her. "These are other victims," he said. "People who saw your story and finally felt safe enough to speak." Ruth's hands trembled as she lifted the first page. A 71-year-old black woman was shoved against her car during a traffic stop. A Latino teenager was forced to the ground because he fit a profile. A disabled veteran was handcuffed for asking a question. A young mother was accused of theft because she took too long in the store. Every complaint is buried. Every voice ignored. Every wound is deep. Her chest burned with a mixture of sorrow and rage. Then Malcolm slid one more document across the table. "This," he said, "is the pharmacy's security footage from the day of your arrest." Ruth watched the footage on his tablet. It showed her politely presenting her husband's information. It showed Reynolds escalating without cause. It showed her trying to explain, trying to reason, trying desperately to preserve her dignity while he crushed it with the ease of routine. But the video captured something else too. Reynolds adjusting his body camera away. Twice, intentionally. A quiet gasp escaped Ruth's lips. "That," Malcolm said, "is obstruction. And it proves he wasn't confused or mistaken. He knew what he was doing." Ruth looked up, tears gathering in her eyes. Not of weakness, but of recognition. This wasn't just about her. It was about everyone who came before her, everyone who would come after. The community speaks by evening. The hospital room felt less like a battlefield and more like the center of a growing movement. Flowers arrived, cards arrived. Messages from former defendants arrived. People Ruth had sentenced fairly, regardless of their circumstances, thanking her for her integrity. A man Ruth barely recognized walked in with his wife and daughter. "Judge Thompson?" he asked quietly. "My name is Leonard Brooks. You sentenced me 12 years ago. You gave me a second chance instead of prison. I have a family now because of you, so I'm here to stand with you." Ruth pressed a hand to her mouth as emotion flooded her. Later that night, another visitor arrived, an elderly black woman with silver braids and a cane. "My name is Sarah Washington," she said, voice steady. "Officer Reynolds threw me to the ground last year. I told myself nobody would believe me. But you made me believe again." She took Ruth's hand. "You're not alone. Not anymore." Tears rolled down Ruth's cheeks. Something inside her, something fragile and exhausted, began knitting itself back together. The leak that changes everything. The next morning, Sabrina Cole sent an encrypted message to Attorney Green. "I have something," she wrote. "Something big." She arrived at the hospital with her laptop, eyes fierce. "This was emailed to me anonymously," she said, "from someone inside the Hillside Police Department." She pressed play. It was the leaked audio. Reynolds' voice came through with chilling clarity. "Target acquired, elderly black female. Perfect, easy stat." Then Officer Torres. "Captain says keep the cameras pointed away if it gets messy." Then Reynolds again, laughing. "Relax, she won't fight. They never do." When the audio ended, the room was silent. Ruth felt the world tilt, as if gravity had shifted beneath her. Her humiliation had not been a mistake. It had been premeditated, planned, discussed, coordinated. Her arrest was not an accident, it was a quota. Her dignity had been collateral damage. Her humanity had been irrelevant. Her safety had been expendable. Something inside her finally snapped, not with rage, but with clarity. "They think we're disposable," she whispered. "They think we don't fight back." Patricia leaned forward. "And that," she said quietly, "is where they're wrong." The FBI enters the scene. 2 days later, a woman in a dark blazer and a federal badge walked into Ruth's hospital room. "Judge Thompson," she said, extending a hand. "I'm Special Agent Elena Ruiz, FBI Civil Rights Division." Ruth's breath hitched. "We've reviewed the audio," Agent Ruiz continued. "We've seen the video. We've analyzed Officer Reynolds' record, as well as internal affairs reports. There are patterns of misrepresentation, suppression of complaints, and racially discriminatory enforcement." Ruth steadied herself. "What does that mean?" she asked. "It means a federal investigation is now open," Agent Ruiz said, "and it won't stop with Officer Reynolds." The words hit like a cleansing fire. Not revenge, not punishment, accountability, finally. The City Council hearing. 1 week later, once Daniel was stable enough to move, he insisted on attending the emergency Hillside City Council hearing beside Ruth. He entered leaning on a cane, his steps unsteady but determined. His presence alone sent a ripple through the packed chamber. Cameras lined the back wall. Reporters murmured. Residents filled every seat. Others crowded the hallways, standing shoulder to shoulder. When Ruth entered, small, dignified, steady, the room erupted into applause. She didn't smile, not because she wasn't grateful, but because this wasn't a celebration. This was Judgment Day. Officer Reynolds sat at a table near the front, pale, hollow-eyed, shoulders trembling. His attorney whispered frantically into his ear, but Reynolds barely responded. He looked like a man watching his world crumble. Council Chairwoman Donna Keller struck the gavel. "This hearing will come to order." Attorney Malcolm Green stepped forward first. "We present evidence," he said, "that Officer Reynolds engaged in a pattern of racially discriminatory arrests, protected by a department culture that prioritized quotas over fairness. Judge Thompson was targeted, humiliated, and arrested without cause, and the audio you are about to hear proves it was intentional." The chamber fell silent. Then the audio played. Reynolds' voice filled the room like poison. "Target acquired. Elderly black female. Perfect." Gasps rippled through the audience. A woman covered her mouth. A man cursed under his breath. Council members exchanged shocked, horrified looks. Reynolds folded into himself, staring at the table as though trying to disappear. Attorney Green turned toward him. "Officer Reynolds," he said, "do you deny these are your words?" Reynolds shook his head weakly. "No," he whispered. The chamber buzzed with outrage. Ruth stood slowly, holding Daniel's hand. She faced the council, not with anger, but with a truth that carried more weight than anger ever could. "Accountability," she said, her voice trembling yet powerful, "is not vengeance. It is healing. It is protection. It is necessary for a community to trust those sworn to protect it." She looked at Reynolds. "You didn't just arrest me," she said softly. "You arrested justice, and today, justice must stand." Reynolds lowered his head. "I resign," he whispered, voice breaking. "Effective immediately." But Ruth shook her head. "This does not end with one resignation." The crowd erupted in applause. Justice, healing, and a new dawn. 6 months after her arrest, on a crisp autumn afternoon, when the leaves in Hillside glowed with amber light, Ruth Thompson walked through the automatic doors of the same pharmacy where everything had begun. The same bell chimed overhead, but everything else was different. The aisles felt softer, quieter, more reverent somehow, as if the walls themselves remembered what had happened here and would never allow it again. Customers looked up, recognizing her instantly, but their expressions held none of the pity from before. Only respect. Michael Nguyen, the pharmacy manager, spotted her and smiled warmly. "Judge Thompson," he greeted, stepping out from behind the counter. "How is Daniel doing?" "Much better," she said, and the glow in her eyes wasn't performative. It was real. "His speech has almost fully recovered. He's walking farther now. He even insisted on raking the yard last week, though he only made it halfway." Michael laughed. "That sounds like him." Ruth nodded, smiling softly. Daniel had fought back as fiercely as she had, but in his own quiet way. Every day he healed a little more, and with each improvement, Ruth felt like she, too, reclaimed a piece of herself. She handed Michael her husband's prescription card. He accepted it with care, not out of formality, but out of gratitude. To him, Ruth was not just a customer anymore. She was the catalyst that forced an entire town and an entire police department to confront the rot it had ignored for far too long. "I'll get this filled right away," he told her. As he walked off, Ruth inhaled deeply, feeling a stillness settle over her chest. This pharmacy, once the scene of her humiliation, had become a place of transformation, a place where truth won. The aftermath of accountability. Officer Mark Reynolds now sat in a federal prison 60 miles away, serving an 18-month sentence for civil rights violations, conspiracy to falsify reports, and obstruction of justice. His partner, Officer Torres, received 12 months. Captain Harris, after lying publicly and threatening Ruth privately, accepted voluntary early retirement when the FBI uncovered years of quota manipulation and internal cover-ups under his leadership. The Hillside Police Department had not just cracked under the weight of truth, it had broken open. Federal oversight was imposed, new leadership installed, internal affairs restructured, quotas abolished, mandatory body camera rules tightened, implicit bias training overhauled, community review boards are empowered, things that should have existed long before one elderly black woman had to be thrown into a patrol car for people to notice the cracks. But they existed now, and those who were once silent had begun to speak. The victims received justice. 11 victims of Reynolds' misconduct received settlements ranging from $40,000 to $250,000, each one an acknowledgement of harm long ignored. But money was not the victory, truth was. For the first time, their stories were believed. For the first time, their pain mattered publicly. For the first time, the system apologized, not privately, but openly. And when Ruth attended the community meeting where the settlements were announced, one of the elderly victims, Mrs. Washington, hugged her tightly and whispered, "You gave us back our voices." Ruth cried in her arms, not from sadness, but from humbling recognition of what collective courage could do. The personal healing. Daniel recovered slowly but steadily. Each morning, Ruth brewed his coffee, now fully caffeinated again. Each afternoon, they walked together up and down the block, his cane tapping softly on the pavement. Each evening, they watched the news, not because they loved politics, but because Ruth now understood how necessary it was to stay vigilant. One night, while they sat side by side on the couch, Daniel turned to her. His eyes, once dimmed by fear and exhaustion, now shone again. "You saved lives," he whispered, squeezing her hand. Ruth looked at him, tears swimming in her eyes. "So did you," she said, because he had reminded her to fight when her strength was breaking, because he had held her steady while the world tried to shake her loose, because he had survived. For them both. The return to the pharmacy. Michael returned with the small orange bottle. "Here you go, Judge Thompson," he said. "I put a note on the account to make sure everything is ready ahead of time each month." "Thank you," Ruth said softly. She held the medication in her hand. The same medication she had tried to pick up the day she was handcuffed. The same medication was scattered across the floor as Reynolds shoved her. The same medication that Daniel missed the dose of before collapsing. Its weight felt different now, heavier, holier. Not because of what it was made of, but because of what it represented. Her love for Daniel, her resilience, her dignity, her truth, her victory. She slipped the bottle into her purse and walked toward the exit. Outside, a new community. On the sidewalk, Ruth paused. Across the street, young people were painting a mural on the side of the Hillside Community Center. A black grandmother holding the hand of a small child. A police officer kneeling, not in submission, but in respect. A crowd behind them, diverse, interconnected, hopeful. Above them, painted in sweeping golden letters, "Respect is a right, not a reward." Ruth's breath hitched as she realized what the woman in the mural was wearing. A navy blue coat, a familiar silver glasses chain, a face lined not with age, but with strength. It was her. Not depicted as a victim, not as a symbol, but as a catalyst. A grandmother who refused to bow, a woman who reminded a community what justice meant. A reminder that dignity, once violated, becomes a force of truth. Moment of private peace. Ruth reached her car. Daniel sat in the passenger seat, humming softly to the radio, blind to the mural but not to her presence. When she opened the door, he smiled. "You took your time," he teased gently. "There was a mural," she said, settling into her seat. "It surprised me. Did you like it?" She nodded, though the word "like" felt far too small. She reached over and took his hand. Their fingers interlaced, as they had on their first date, their wedding day, the day they bought this house, and every day she had visited him in the hospital. "Ready to go home?" he asked. She squeezed his hand softly. "More than ever." He looked out the window as she started the engine. "I'm proud of you, Ruth," he whispered. She swallowed hard. For months, she fought because she had to, because injustice demanded it, because silence would have been a betrayal, because fear could not be allowed to win. But hearing those words from Daniel made it all come together. She had fought, she had survived, and she had won. But not for the headlines, not for her reputation, for love, for truth, for everyone who needed someone to speak first so they could speak next. The moral lesson. What her story taught Ruth Thompson's journey taught a community and a nation, something timeless. Racism does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers through policies, quotas, assumptions, and unchecked power. But truth, when spoken boldly, can transform whispers into reckoning. She reminded people that dignity is not something granted by officers or systems. It is something carried in the soul. She proved that even those who try to silence justice cannot stop it. They may bruise it, humiliate it, threaten it, delay it. But justice, like truth, rises. And it rises through us. When we speak up, when we stand up, when we refuse to turn away, when we protect one another, when we choose love instead of fear, unity instead of division, courage instead of silence. Ruth did not seek to destroy a man. She sought to heal a system. And in doing so, she helped build a stronger, kinder, more accountable America. One where no elderly woman should fear being handcuffed for caring for her husband. One where no officer is above the law. One where communities demand humanity and protect it. The end, but not the end. As Ruth and Daniel drove home beneath the warm, orange sky, she reached out and rested her hand on his knee. Sometimes justice wears reading glasses. Sometimes it walks with a cane. Sometimes it survives humiliation and emerges stronger. Sometimes it looks like the quiet courage of a woman whose love for her family overpowered her fear of a broken system. And sometimes, justice sounds like 5 simple words that change everything. I am a federal judge. But her story did not really end with that revelation. It ended with something far larger. A community awakened, a system changed, a truth spoken, a love sustained, and a nation reminded that we must reject racism, embrace kindness, protect one another, and stand united. Because America becomes stronger every time ordinary people choose to be extraordinary. And Ruth Thompson did exactly that. A call to heart, a call to America. In the end, Ruth Thompson's story reminds us of something deeper than law, deeper than power, deeper than pain. Human dignity is sacred. Human connection is our greatest strength. And when one of us suffers, all of us are called to stand up. Ruth's journey was not just about one woman or one officer. It was about a truth this country must never ignore. Racism does not fade on its own. It fades because we confront it. It fades because we refuse to accept silence. It fades because ordinary people choose courage over comfort. Her courage lit a spark that awakened neighbors, inspired allies, and demanded accountability from a system that had forgotten its purpose. And in that courage, we saw something beautiful. The power of community, the power of compassion, the power of standing up for one another. That is how a stronger America is built. One act of bravery, one voice raised in truth, one hand reaching out to lift another. Let Ruth's story remind us to choose kindness even when it costs us. Howsti to choose justice even when it scares us. Timonier to choose love even when the world feels heavy. Tiwi to protect the vulnerable. Tibrikatonan to defend dignity wherever we find it threatened. Because when we show up for each other, when we refuse to let injustice go unchallenged, when we choose love over hate, that is when America becomes its truest and strongest self. If Ruth can rise, if her community can rise, then so can we. If this story moved you, inspired you, or opened your eyes, I invite you, from the heart, from the soul, to stay connected with us. Subscribe to the Racial Truth YouTube channel to support more stories that illuminate injustice, uplift courage, and honor those who fight for what's right. Visit the channel and explore our other videos, each one crafted to spark empathy, deepen understanding, and push us all toward a more loving America. Your voice matters. Your awareness matters. Your presence matters. Thank you for listening. Thank you for feeling. Thank you for standing on the side of truth, compassion, and unity. Together, we can build a better, kinder, stronger America, one story at a time.